moment ago, for all of the efforts that have been made, and there is much to learn from what has worked, the fact remains, as the IRC report makes clear, that there are many communities in Northern Ireland that continue to suffer real harm because of their activities. What is the proof of those who say they're prepared to disband? The proof will be, do they end recruitment, paramilitary style assaults, intimidation, child criminal and sexual exploitation, and violence against women and girls, because that is what people are experiencing today in Northern Ireland.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Secretary of State as well. I want all paramilitaries off our streets for good, and I also want to see justice done for their victims. That's why I just can't quite understand why the Dublin government are closing their eyes to the 2021 Horner judgment recommending inquiries both in the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. The family hearings in Omagh have brought the horror of that day to a new generation. So will the Secretary of State use his influence to call on Dublin to give the Omagh families the public inquiry they deserve and they want so much?
Thursday.
Well, I recognise that, not least because of the commemorative hearings that have been taking place in the inquiry, all of the pain and the suffering, the horror, the tragedy of that day has been brought to life again for the families who live with it every single day of the week. I welcome the fact that the Irish Government is committed to cooperate with the Omagh inquiry. I look forward to the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding. It is for the Irish Government to decide what inquiries they wish to establish in relation to events in the Republic.
Gregory Catt.
Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
The Secretary of State has met with suppliers, and my officials meet regularly with horticultural industry representatives. The next meeting of the Horticultural Working Group is in 2 days' time, and the Government is committed to addressing the outstanding issues on horticultural products to ensure that these can move safely within the UK.
Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation does remain very, very difficult. In fact, the Horticultural Trades Association said that it remains impossible for some retailers who are trying to order product from GB-based companies to consumers in Northern Ireland. Everyone can complain about this. Some of us are trying to do something about it. The government are the people who can bring pressure to bear to resolve this. What action has been taken to try and resolve this problem for consumers in Northern Ireland?
Minister.
DEFRA officials are following up specifically with those companies that are most affected, for example, seed shipping companies. Shipping seeds is allowed using phytosanitary certificates, but posting business to business is currently smoother than business to consumer. So, ways to find solutions to this are being worked out within the requirements of the Windsor Framework, and guidance should be updated shortly.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tonya Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for her answer, but we want to know more detail around the progress that the Horticultural Working Group is making to help to resolve these issues with plants and cut flowers from the movements of GB to NI under the Windsor Framework. So can she please update it as a matter of urgency?
Minister.
I can provide more updates, but for example, on the banned plants, they're being worked through species by species. There were 11 in 2023, 10 in 2024, and we're working through each one of those. So the working group is taking each of the issues on a case-by-case basis and working through each of those issues as it arises.
Alex Easton.
Mr. Speaker, could I ask the Minister about veterinary medical supplies for Northern Ireland with the grace period about to run out within the next year? What are the plans to make sure that Northern Ireland doesn't run out of veterinary medicines?
Minister.
We're working actively to narrow the range of products where there's a problem, but working with each one of those as well. So this is an active consideration, knowing that, as the member points out, the deadline is approaching.
Lee Ingham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Windsor Framework was a distinct improvement on the old Northern Ireland Protocol. But does the Minister agree with me that to ensure the smoothest possible movement of agri-food products across the Irish Sea, it's vital we secure an SPS agreement with the EU?
I agree with my right honourable friend that the Windsor Framework is a big improvement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and we are committed to implementing the Windsor Framework at the same time as seeking to negotiate an SPS agreement that would provide further improvements to the movement of agri-food products. And we must pave the way to this by resetting our relationship with the EU and implementing the Windsor Framework in good faith.
Sir Desmond Swig.
Number 6, sir.
Secretary of State.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 6 and 11 together. The approach taken by the previous government to legacy was wrong. It caused immense pain to victims and survivors, and in many respects has been found to be unlawful. In December, I laid a proposal for a draft remedial order to address the human rights deficiencies in the Act identified by the courts, and when parliamentary time allows, I will introduce primary legislation to reinstate legacy inquests halted by the Act and to reform and strengthen the ICRIR.
Sir Desmond.
Why did he abandon the appeal in Dillon and Oars? Great question.
Because clauses 46 and 47 were found to be unlawful, and as he will be aware, the case that gave rise to the attempt to deal with the problem by those clauses that have now been found to be unlawful came from a Supreme Court judgment in 2020, and for two and a bit years the previous government was unable to find a solution.
Gagan Mahendra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding the Northern Ireland Secretary's response just there, why is this Labour government continue to undermine the tough action taken by the Conservative government on individuals who have acted against our democracy and society, such as Gerry Adams, by considering repealing the Legacy Act, giving him and others the possibility of a 6-figure payout?
Well, as I've indicated to the House at the last Northern Ireland oral questions, nobody wants to see that happen. We are currently working to find a lawful way of dealing with the problems that were created by the way in which the original interim custody orders were signed in 1972 and I think 1973, which the Supreme Court in 2020 found, where they were not signed and considered by the Secretary of State, were not lawful.
Louise Haig.
In 2019, Boris Johnson commissioned the Shawcross report into Libyan-sponsored IRA terrorism. US citizens have received compensation from the Libyan government for attacks on British soil, but UK citizens never have. Will the Secretary of State work with the FCDO to ensure that the Shawcross report is published?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, and the whole House will have profound sympathy for all the victims of Gaddafi-sponsored IRA terrorism and all the victims of the Troubles. The Shawcross report was commissioned by the previous government as an internal report, and decisions on the report and its future are currently under review by the FCDO.
Go through, yeah. Shadow Minister Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People right across the United Kingdom will be disgusted if former terrorists like Gerry Adams get compensation from the taxpayer because of Labour's decision to repeal the Legacy Act without putting something in its place. Will the Secretary of State finally commit to legislating immediately to prevent this from happening?
Well, I refer the honourable gentleman to the answer I gave a moment ago on that issue.
Right. We now come to Prime Minister's questions. We start with Dr. Luke Evans.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week marked 3 years since Putin's barbaric invasion of Ukraine. The courage of the Ukrainians is inspiring, and across this House we stand with them for as long as it takes. Mr. Speaker, that's why we're increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by April 2027, with an ambition to reach 3% in the next Parliament as economic and fiscal conditions allow. And this afternoon, of course, I will travel to the US to have discussions with President Trump about the enduring security partnership between our two countries. Mr. Speaker, I'm also delighted that we've announced the first 750 schools to start offering free breakfast clubs. This is our plan for change in action, ensuring every child has the chance to thrive. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in thanking Amanda Pritchard for her services as Chief Executive of the NHS England, and I wish her well for the future. This morning, Mr. Speaker, I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Luca.
Could the Prime Minister tell this House whether the outcome of his budget was by design or by mistake? Did he mean to push 100,000 pensioners into poverty with his own analysis when he removed the winter fuel allowance, or was that a mistake? Did he mean to decimate family farming when he changed the inheritance tax, or was that a mistake? And did he mean to tax GPs, care homes and hospices when he raised NICs, or was that a mistake? Prime Minister, could he tell the House, are these acceptable collateral damage in his path for change, or simply a mistake that need rectifying?
I'll tell you what was a mistake, leaving a £22 billion black hole that we had to sort out. We took the difficult decisions, investing in our NHS, and I would have thought he would have welcomed the 2 million extra appointments that we've achieved in the first 7 months of a Labour government. That's the difference our budget is making to people.
Alex McIntyre.
Delighted that Carlton and Grange primary schools in my city of Gloucester will be part of the first 750 schools to get free breakfast clubs. And I am pleased that this government is already delivering on its manifesto promises in less than a year. So will the Prime Minister agree with me that by helping working parents with childcare and delivering the best start to the day for every single child, we are delivering opportunity for the next generation?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend. We're pleased that 2 of the early adopter schools will be in his constituency. Mr. Speaker, we're ensuring that all primary school children aged can get access to free breakfast and at least 30 minutes of free childcare. And that means every child ready to learn, and parents, of course, supported with up to £450 a year back in their pockets. That's the change a Labour government makes.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Bennell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish the Prime Minister every success on his trip to Washington. The visit to see President Trump must serve our national interest. The Prime Minister and I are completely united in our support for Ukraine as a proud and sovereign nation. Yeah. What specific steps will he take to ensure Ukraine is at the negotiating table for any peace settlement?
Well, I thank her for her words about the forthcoming trip. And it is right, and I think the whole House will think it's right, that Ukraine must be at the table at negotiations. There can be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine. That has been my consistent position in all of the discussions that I've had. That will continue to be my position, because this is about the sovereignty of Ukraine and their ability to decide for themselves the future of their country. So they must be at the table.
Kemi Bennell.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer, and as I said, I wish him every success. We want to support him on this issue. So turning to the details of the plan he set out yesterday. Over the weekend, I suggested to the Prime Minister that he cut the aid budget, and I'm pleased that he accepted my advice. Mr. Speaker, it's the fastest response. It's the fastest response I've ever had from the Prime Minister. However, he announced £13.4 billion in additional defence spending yesterday. This morning, his Defence Secretary said the uplift is only £6 billion, which is the correct figure.
Prime Minister.
I'm going to have to let the Leader of the Opposition down gently. She didn't feature in my thinking at all. I was so busy over the weekend I didn't even see her proposal. I think she's appointed herself, I think, saviour of the Western civilization. It's a desperate search for relevance. But, Mr. Speaker, look, if you take the numbers for this financial year, And then the numbers for the financial year 27-28, that's £13.4 billion increase. That is the largest sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War, which will put us in a position to ensure the security and defence of our country and of Europe.
Mr. Speaker, that wasn't very clear. How is it that the Defence Secretary says £6 billion and he says £13.4 billion? The IFS said today that the government is playing silly games with numbers. How does he find this difference in numbers?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we went through this 2 weeks ago, going through the same question over and over again. So let me say it. If you take the financial year this year, and then you take the financial year for 2027-28, the difference between the two is £13.4 billion. That's the same answer. If you ask again, I'll give the same answer again.
I'll decide when it's more.
Mr. Speaker, someone needs to tell the Prime Minister that being patronising is not a substitute. Not a substitute for answering questions. It's not a substitute. He hasn't answered. What he has said is different from what he said yesterday. We are still not clear where the money is coming from. We want to support him. He's also said that we should put British troops on the ground in Ukraine. We haven't seen the detail of any proposals. Would his new spending plans allow him to fund this commitment effectively?
Prime Minister.
I mean, I think it's the same question again. It's £13.4 billion. That's the difference between this year and 2020. She asked a serious question about the security guarantees in Ukraine, and that is extremely important, because the worst of all outcomes, if there's to be a cessation of hostilities, is that it is a short break rather than sustained and lasting peace. And I think that that means there's got to be security guarantees. I've indicated that we will play our full part. There has to be US backing, because otherwise I don't think it will deter Putin. We are working on that. I'm having extensive discussions about it, not in a position to put details before the House, as she well knows today, but I'll continue down that route, because I want a lasting peace in Ukraine and Europe for the safety and security of Ukrainians, of Europeans, and of course for everybody in this country.
Mr. Speaker, this is an endeavour that we want to support him in, but we need to know exactly what it is we're supporting. We need clarity and transparency over the money. We also need to know where this money is going. This morning, the Defence Secretary could not say if the Chagos deal would come out of the defence budget. Can he confirm to the House that none of the defence uplift includes payments for his Chagos deal?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the additional spend I announced yesterday is for our capability on defence and security in Europe, as I made absolutely clear yesterday. The Chagos deal is extremely important for our security, for US security. The US are rightly looking at it. When it's finalised, I'll put it before the House with the costings. The figures being bandied around are absolutely wild of the mark. The deal is well over a century, but the funding I announced yesterday is for our capability to put ourselves in a position to rise to a generational challenge. That is what that money is all about, and I thought she supported it.
Speaker, we need to make sure we are supporting a plan that is clear and transparent. Yesterday, the Prime Minister set an ambition for defence spending to reach 3% in the next Parliament. We agree with him, but this could be 2034, almost a decade away. That is too slow. We don't know how he will pay for it. We cannot raise taxes further. We already pay more on debt interest than defence, and everyone in this House would have heard him not answer the last question. So I will ask him again. Is he paying for the Chagos deal with this defence uplift or not?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, I've just dealt with that question. She gave her... The money announced yesterday is going to our capability to put ourselves in a position to defend the security of our country, Europe and the UK. And she asked about defence spending. She gave what people have described as a rambling speech yesterday when she couldn't say what defence spending should be. We've been absolutely clear. We've set it out, a full, credible, costed plan, and I thought she supported it.
Holly Billington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that in coastal communities like mine in East Thanet, people develop cancer earlier, get treated and diagnosed later, and die younger. Can he give the House an update on the plans for the Government to implement the recommendations by the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, into tackling poor health in our seaside towns?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising this. She's right that cancer patients are waiting too long for diagnosis and for treatment. Addressing healthcare inequity is part of our 10-year health plan, Mr. Speaker, aiming to halve the gap in healthy life expectancy between the richest and the poorest regions. And we're making progress on that already.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by wishing the Prime Minister well on his trip to the White House? It won't be an easy meeting, but we're all behind him for our national interest. But it's already clear that under President Trump, we won't be able to rely on the United States, sadly, to help ensure our security against Russian aggression. And that's why we strongly welcome the Prime Minister's decision to increase Britain's defence spending. But Europe must do far more to rearm in the face of Putin's threat, and the UK must lead on that. That's why we back the idea of a new European rearmament bank, so we can finance a big increase in the manufacturing capacity without the need to cut Britain's vital soft power. So will the Prime Minister look at this idea, work across this House and across Europe, so we can make a European rearmament bank actually happen?
Prime Minister.
I'll resist his suggestion that we've got somehow to choose between the US and our European partners. I do not believe that to be the case, and I want to strengthen our already strong relationship with the US, because I think it's vital that we do so. I, of course, want to work with our European allies on defence capability and what more we need to do in relation to capability, coordination and funding. And in the longer term, there is a discussion going on amongst allies as to future funding. We're part of that discussion, and I'm happy to share that with the House as it evolves.
Sir Ed Davey.
I hope he's successful in keeping the US on board with our European allies, and I'm glad he's talking about finance and defence. I think if he was to push this European rearmament bank at the summit on Sunday, the European leaders, I think he'd be pushing an open door. Certainly Prime Minister Tusk is supporting from the Polish point of view. But, Mr. Speaker, if I can turn now to domestic matters and the cost of living crisis that's hitting so many of our constituents. Families in my constituency are really angry that Thames Water is sending them bills this April that will cost them £150 a year more. Thames has already let down so many people, whether it's leaking pipes or pumping their filthy sewage into our rivers. A third of customers' bills are already used just to pay the interest on Thames Water's debt, and now it's going to borrow £3 billion more. Isn't it time to stop making people pay for bailing out the vulture funds drowning Thames Water in debt? Will his government just put this firm out of its misery, put it into special administration so we can sort out that mess and the mess that lot left?
Well, he's certainly right about the mess that lot made. We've obviously got the water bill. It's got very strong measures in it, and I think he supports them.
Dr. Rosanna Allen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have heard extraordinary rhetoric coming out of Washington in recent days, and we have seen fascist salutes on our screens. We have witnessed wild statements about Palestinians being expelled from Gaza, and we have seen our allies labelled dictators. Britain's interests are best served by standing with Ukraine, working closely with our European allies, by upholding international law and remaining a strong part of NATO. Can the Prime Minister assure us that this will form a central part of his message when he meets world leaders this week?
Minister.
Well, we certainly stand with Ukraine, and I think I speak for the whole House when I say that. And as I set out yesterday, NATO is the bedrock of our security. It's been our most important alliance for many, many years, as important today as it's ever been. And we build that alliance by working with the US. We have a special and deep relationship with the US. That's not just words, that's to do with security, defence, intelligence capability, vitally important for both sides. But we also work with our European allies, and it is that ability to work with the US and the EU and European partners that has held the peace for so many years and needs to hold the peace for many years to come.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prior to the election, the Labour Party promised to reduce energy bills by £300, yet on their watch, energy bills are about to increase by almost £300. So may I ask, is the failure to keep that promise a consequence of government incompetency, or have the Labour Party been caught lying to the public?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of the fact that we are pushing forward for energy independence, which will keep our bills lower. And he knows very well what my position is. But I note that, again, he's very quiet on the SNP record. And I'll tell you for why. Just this week, we've seen the attainment gap widen in Scotland, pupils leaving schools with no qualifications rising, those from deprived areas going to work falling. Instead of playing the politics of grievance, they need to take responsibility for their own record.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Mike Addison was one of a kind, a physical disability rugby league world champion with England and Warrington Wolves, and an avid volunteer for the club and foundation. He was a friend to everyone who knew him. Tragically, he died at age 45, having taken his own life. One death by suicide is too many, and every suicide is preventable. But ONS data puts the rate in the North West at over double the rate of London, and with a 17% increase last year. So can the Prime Minister outline what more can be done working across government to help Warrington meet our target of eliminating suicide?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank her for raising this tragic case? And my thoughts, I'm sure the thoughts of the House, are with the family, friends and teammates of Mike at Warrington Wolves. I mean, she's right, Mr. Speaker, that one death by suicide is one too many, and reducing the number is a vital part of our health mission. We are recruiting an additional 8,500 mental health workers, especially trained to support people at risk of suicide. We're committed to taking forward the suicide prevention strategy for England. I'm sure this is something the whole House will support.
Dr. Neil Butts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement committing us to increased defence spending and reaffirming the UK's support for Ukraine and their democratically elected leader, President Zelensky. A wartime leader, like Winston Churchill, who also had to delay elections because his country faced an existential threat. As the Prime Minister travels to Washington, with this House and the country willing him to succeed, will he invoke the legacy of Churchill in making the case for the UK to be the key in bridging transatlantic relations, to bring us all together for the sake of freedom and democracy across the world?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for his question. Can I pick up on both elements? Because President Zelensky is a democratically elected leader, and suspending elections was precisely what we did in this country when we were fighting in the Second World War. And secondly, on his point, yes, I do think that the UK has successfully been a bridge between the US and Europe for many, many years. It's vital that we continue in that role, and that's why my message to President Trump is that the relationship between our two countries needs to go from strength to strength. It's all very strong, but also working at the same time with our European allies.
Jessica T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday night, there was a brutal double stabbing in my constituency. This adds to a long line of horrific knife attacks that have included 3 fatalities over the past 2 years. I know the Prime Minister is aware of the particular challenges we face in Bournemouth, and while crime has been going down, I know there is much more he will want to do. So will he join me in praising the crucial work that organisations like Changes Are Made, who give positive activities like boxing to young people, and will he share what more the government can do to tackle knife crime in communities like mine?
Prime Minister.
Thank you for raising this really important issue. Yesterday we introduced our crime and policing bill, which is central to our plan for change and halving knife crime. It involves new powers to seize and destroy knives found on private property and a new criminal offence of possessing a bladed article with intent to cause harm. Plus, Mr. Speaker, tougher penalties for selling dangerous weapons to under-18s, stricter rules for online sales under Ronan's law, and we'll continue with that work.
Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The floods of 2013-14 devastated Datchet, Horton and Wraysbury, and the flooding last January wasn't much better. But shockingly, the River Thames scheme as currently proposed continues to leave my constituents at risk. The Council was asked to cough up tens of millions, but like very many, is cash-strapped. Does the Prime Minister, therefore, agree with me that the only option to protect my constituents is funding Channel 1 of the River Thames scheme as the national strategic infrastructure, which it really is?
Prime Minister.
Well, I know the honourable member has raised this issue before, and it's obviously an important issue for his constituents. We inherited flood defences in their worst state on record, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're investing £2.6 billion to protect over 50,000 properties. I understand that the options to reduce flood risk to these communities are being considered as part of the Datchet and Hythe End Flood Alleviation Scheme, and I'll ensure that he has a meeting with the relevant minister to take forward the work.
Sally Jameson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order for the government's growth agenda to be a success, it must be felt in all areas of the country, including Doncaster and South Yorkshire, where we have green growth transport companies, including hybrid air vehicles and clean power hydrogen, alongside the reopening of Doncaster Sheffield Airport. So will the Prime Minister put on his record support for Mayor Ros Jones, who has led on the airport reopening, and also set out how the growth agenda will override those traditional patterns of investment mainly in the south of England and bring prosperity to South Yorkshire and indeed the north as a whole?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I will. Doncaster's got a proud industrial heritage, rail, steel and coal, an extraordinary potential for industries of the future, from hydrogen to AI, and we are focused, Mr. Speaker, on devolving more power and funding to metro mayors to support regional industry. We will work with the mayors of Doncaster and South Yorkshire to support efforts to reopen Doncaster Sheffield Airport.
Graham Ladbitter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the privilege to represent the home of Speyside malts, some amongst the finest Scotch whiskies. Last week, the UK Government unveiled damaging plans to grant a different definition of single malt to English producers to that of Scottish single malts. This is entirely inconsistent with the global reputation of the quality of single malts and seeks to tear up a well-established definition of what a single malt is, pulling the rug yet further from underneath the Scotch whisky industry. Given the backlash from the industry to this and the damage this could cause to Scotch whisky exports and jobs, will the Prime Minister's word on whisky be his whisky bond by backing the industry to the hilt and scrapping these plans?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we do support Scotch whisky. It's a really important part of our economy, and that's why we allocated £5 million in the budget, and why we're working with Brazil, which is worth £25 million for Scotch whisky. It's what we're doing to support industry and sectors in Scotland. And in addition to that, in another sector, at the weekend I was very pleased to be able to announce the £200 million investment in Grangemouth and the future for generations there.
Steve Race.
Speaker, yesterday I returned from Ukraine, having spent 4 days with a cross-party delegation of parliamentarians. The Ukrainians we met from across society had one simple message. They were deeply thankful for our partnership, and they want us to know that they can overcome the Russian invasion because they must. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that alongside our welcome 100-year partnership, now is the time for the UK to redouble our efforts alongside our European partners to help secure Ukraine's future as a free, democratic and sovereign European nation?
Yes, I do, and I'm really proud of the way the United Kingdom has risen to the challenge of the last 3 years in a united way, both in terms of the capability and funding that we provided to Ukraine, but also the throwing open of homes here for those fleeing. And I was privileged to welcome some of the families to Downing Street on Monday, and it was a human reminder of the impact that it's having on them, their children and their families.
Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House wants the Prime Minister's meeting with President Trump to be a success, which requires credibility on our defence spending commitments. The Leader of the Opposition gave the Prime Minister an opportunity to unambiguously rule out the funding of any Chagos deal coming from the defence budget, and I'm not clear that he did that. I want him to be taken seriously in Washington, so I'll make it really easy for him. Will he rule out the funding of any Chagos deal coming from the defence budget, yes or no?
Yes. Prime Minister.
Speaker, as I said, when the deal is when the deal is complete, I will put it before the House with the costings. The money yesterday was allocated to our capability, the single biggest increase, sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War.
Diane Abbott.
The whole country stands behind the people of Ukraine. But there is also a view that taking money from aid and development to spend on armaments and tanks makes people less safe, not more safe, because the desperation and the poverty that so often leads to warfare is what aid and development money is supposed to counter.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said yesterday, the overseas development is important. I'm proud of what we've done. It wasn't a decision I took lightly or I wanted to take, but it is important at this moment that we put the defence spending, the defence and security of our country and Europe uppermost. We will, of course, make sure that we're able to fulfil our humanitarian obligations in relation to Gaza, Ukraine and Sudan and other vital work. And I want to be clear that we do, of course, want to go back and increase that funding as soon as we're able to do so.
Simon Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the Prime Minister knows that when he does travel to Washington to meet the former leader of the free world, he does so with the hopes and prayers of this House and the country. Probably no more serious a meeting could be taking place. Now, whilst Ukraine will clearly dominate, will the Prime Minister undertake to raise with President Trump that Canada is a valued, respected and much-loved member of both NATO and our Commonwealth, and that this childish nonsense of a 51st state should be called out by the Prime Minister for what it is?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this issue. UK and Canada are close allies and have been for a very long time, with a partnership based on a shared history and a shared set of values and a determination to be an active force for good in the world. We work closely with them on issues of the Commonwealth, on NATO and, of course, Five Eyes, intelligence sharing, and we will work to strengthen that relationship.
Michelle Scrocklin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Barrow-in-Furness has always been ahead of the times in terms of high-skilled engineering. In light of the Prime Minister's historic commitment to rise defence spending, the biggest increase since the end of the Cold War, I invite him to visit and see the many SMEs who could support this vital supply chain. Does he agree that investing in these businesses will not only deliver our nuclear deterrent, but improve security and the economy for us all?
Well, I thank her for raising this question and will obviously consider her invitation. Defence spending, Mr. Speaker, already supports more than 430,000 jobs across the United Kingdom, and I'd like to recognise the contribution made by the workers in Barrow-in-Furness.
Wendy Morton.
Mr. Speaker, in my constituency, the planning inspector chose to use the term grey belt to pass a battery energy storage system application before the order was laid in this House to change the NPPF, and without recognising the moratorium for local authorities to manage their local plans. This decision failed to recognise the green belt that protects us against urban sprawl, and it failed to recognise the proximity to a school, a church and a graveyard. So can the Prime Minister define what grey belt actually is, or is it simply a grey area to allow for inappropriate development?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not across the details of the individual case that she raises, as she will understand, but I am in favour of making sure that we can have the infrastructure and the houses that we need to grow our economy. And one of the problems we had in the last 14 years was an assertional rhetoric that we wanted homes and infrastructure, but when the decision all that came up, the answer was always no. The answer cannot always be no.
John McDonnell.
Can I thank the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary for their efforts to secure the release of Allah Abdel Fattah, the human rights campaigner, the British human rights campaigner, who's been imprisoned in Egypt now for over 10 years. The Prime Minister will know, because he's met the family, that his mother is on the 150th day of her hunger strike and her health is failing rapidly. could I ask the Prime Minister to pick up the phone to President Sisi and seek the release of Allah to save his life, also that of his mother's?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this really important case, and as he says, I did meet the mother and the family just a few days ago, and it is an incredibly difficult situation for them, and I can assure him I will do everything I can to ensure the release in this case, and that includes phone calls as necessary. I've raised it before, I'll raise it again, we raise it and will continue to do so. I gave my word to the family that that's what I do, that I will do, and I will.
Hannah.
People in Northern Ireland are sick to the teeth of paramilitaries, of the menace, of the sectarianism and of keeping people stuck in the past. In light of the announcement yesterday on transition, does the Prime Minister recognise that people will be highly sceptical of this process, that there must be real learnings from the failed transitions of the past, that there can be no rewards for paramilitaries for hanging on, robust criminal justice, the flags off the lampposts and on street corners, and community-funded policing to allow communities that have been brutalised by paramilitaries to finally look forward to a confident and shared future?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank him for raising this important and obviously sensitive issue? We are committed to making progress towards ending paramilitarism once and for all in Northern Ireland, and that's why we've agreed to support a short independent exercise to look at a formal process, and I'll make sure that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland keeps her updated.
Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, prostate cancer is now our country's most common cancer, and yet there is no national screening programme. We made progress towards this in government, but yet there is more to do, which is why I'm delighted to have joined Prostate Cancer Research, the charity, as an ambassador. I'm grateful to the Health Secretary for his engagement thus far, and could I ask the Prime Minister to ensure that we do have a targeted national screening programme for the most at-risk groups of prostate cancer, so that we can not only save the NHS money, make progress towards the government's early diagnosis targets, but most crucially, save thousands of lives?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank him for raising this, and can I thank him for using his authority and reputation to support this vital cause, which will make a material difference, and I look forward to working with him on it. We do share a commitment to detecting prostate cancer earlier and treating it faster, and we must do that. Our National Cancer Plan will improve the way we treat cancer right across the country, and I'll make sure he's fully informed of the steps that we're taking, and we'll work with him.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join with me in wishing all Welsh citizens everywhere a very happy St David's Day on Saturday? And will he also join with me in welcoming the latest news of the £600 million investment by Copenhagen infrastructure partners to ensure that Bute Energy and Green Gen Cymru can take forward the bold ambition to achieve 100% green electricity production by 2035 in Wales, thus providing much-needed sustainable green jobs for the people of Wales?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I wish her and her constituents a very happy St David's Day and join her in welcoming this significant new investment into her constituency that will ensure good jobs, well-paid, skilled jobs, and, of course, the transition to energy security and lower bills. And I know her constituency will play a vital role in that.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that our biggest single foreign policy priority is the preservation of NATO with America at its heart? And if so, following his welcome announcement yesterday, is the next step to talk to our European allies and for all of us to agree to spend 3% of GDP on defence within a specified timescale, so that we can look the President in the eye and say that Europe is finally pulling its weight on defence?
Prime Minister.
Well, I agree with him entirely in terms of the priority in terms of NATO. Putin thought he could weaken NATO. He's only made it stronger and larger. NATO's strength comes from the US and European partners and others working together, and that is absolutely the focus of my work at the moment. It is right, as he says, that European countries, including the United Kingdom, do need to do more on capability, on coordination and on defence spend. That must be not seen as a project separate to NATO, but part of an essential project that ensures that NATO is there for decades and decades to come, preserving the peace, just as it has been for 75 years.
Final question, Newman Steinbeck.
Mr Speaker, the Grangemouth refinery closure has loomed over central Scotland since Petronas' announcement in November 2023. 2 weeks ago, Scottish Labour colleagues and I met with the National Wealth Fund to make the case for investment in Grangemouth. I strongly welcome the exceptional commitment this Labour government has shown to Grangemouth by committing £200 million from the National Wealth Fund. Can I ask the Prime Minister what steps the government will be taking to secure permanent, good jobs at Grangemouth?
Well, can I thank him for being such a great champion for Scotland and his constituency? Mr Speaker, Grangemouth is really important to communities in Scotland, to the economy in Scotland. It's not a charity case, it's got incredible potential, huge opportunity, and that's why at the weekend I was very pleased to announce £200 million from the National Wealth Fund to incentivise private investment. That, of course, Mr Speaker, follows £100 million in the growth deal that we announced earlier. This is about jobs for decades to come in Grangemouth. It's a really exciting opportunity and we intend to seize it.
I hope His Presidency of the Assembly of North Macedonia, His Excellency Mr Afrim Gasha, enjoyed questions. Right, that completes PMQs. Right, let us come to the 10-minute rule motion. Statement. What is it? Right, let's come to the statement on housing communities and local government. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This government accepts that the final report of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry must be the catalyst for long-lasting systemic change. All members of the House, past and present, will have shared my anger over its shocking findings. The inquiry chair, Sir Martin Morbick, and his dedicated team uncovered damning evidence of political, corporate and individual failings going back decades. These led to the loss of 72 innocent lives. 18 of them were children. On that terrible night in June 2017. Madam Deputy Speaker, it was a deadly betrayal, a national tragedy, but that must never happen again. I will repeat today what the Prime Minister said in September. To bereave families, the survivors, and those in the immediate Grenfell community, and some of whom are with us today in the gallery, on behalf of the government, the British state, and those responsible, I am very sorry. The inquiry report made 58 recommendations, of which 37 were directed at the government. The government accepts the findings of the report and will take forward all the recommendations. Our response, published today, addresses each in turn and goes further to set out our wider reforms of social housing and on the construction sector. As we make these vital changes, we will publish quarterly reports on the progress and update Parliament annually. The government is open to scrutiny and will remain accountable for its actions. We will prioritise residents and protect their interests, and make sure that industry builds safe homes, and provide clearer accountability and enforcement. To have anyone, anywhere, living in an unsafe home is one person too many. That will be our guiding principle, and must be that of anyone who wants to build or care for our homes. That will be an important part of the legacy of Grenfell. Madam Deputy Speaker, for nearly 8 years, despite their pain, the bereaved, survivors and members of the community have campaigned with determination, not wanting anyone to suffer as they have. And it is fair to say that the building system that we have today is not the same as the one that was justly criticised in the report. The one to support contractors and to review the role of building control, where standards are clear and industry has clarity and certainty on how individuals and firms must behave. It encourages investor confidence. And this will improve the safety of residents, support the construction industry and our mission to deliver economic growth. We have pledged to build 1.5 million homes over the Parliament to tackle our country's acute housing crisis, part of our plan for change to improve the lives of people across the country. And it is vital that these future homes, as well as existing homes, are safe and of a high quality. And I welcome how some parts of the industry have stepped up to lead the necessary change in culture and approach. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, lest we forget. Sir Martin found that just about every institution and organisation charged with keeping the tower safe and protecting those who called it home failed. His most devastating conclusion was that every single death was avoidable. The inquiry uncovered serial incompetence and negligence, complacency and inaction, and blatant dishonesty and greed. The organisations that failed included the government and regulators. The department that I now lead, which failed to act on known risks and ignored, delayed or disregarded matters affecting the safety of life. And the manufacturing companies, including Arcanic, Kingspan and Celotex, whose products were used to refurbish the tower, the report found that they acted with systemic dishonesty and they missold and they marketed them. Their disgraceful mercenary behaviour put profit before people and exploited the regulatory regime to evade accountability with fatal consequences. And to my disgust and their shame, some have shown little remorse and have refused to even help fix the building safety crisis that they did so much to create. Companies must be held to account for their role in Grenfell. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Cabinet Office is announcing today that she will use new powers under the Procurement Act to investigate Arconic, Kingspan, Saint-Aubin as owners of Celotex at the time and other organisations. And I expect swift, decisive action and will ensure progress is reported. But we must do more to make sure that the right rules are in place. To this day, critical gaps persist in how construction products are regulated. Only with rigorous reform will we transform the culture that allowed the tragedy to happen. Madam Deputy Speaker, to achieve this, we are also publishing today a Construction Products Reform Green Paper. It will help us to cut out the rot in the sector and allow competence to take root. Safety will come first and a culture of responsibility will prevail. We will celebrate those that lead the way and those that fall short will suffer the consequences. In the future, road companies will be held to account. Our Green Paper sets out our ideas for how
prison time for executives who break the rules, and unlimited fines where safety is put at risk. We will do whatever it takes. Across the sector, we know that there is appetite for change. That change is overdue, and we will lead it. I've paid tribute to the enduring resilience and resolve of the bereaved families and the survivors and members of the immediate community. Their campaigning has seen new legislation passed, which members of this government also supported, that has made our public realm more secure. Everyone is safer thanks to the Building Safety Act, which set new standards for construction of residential buildings in England. It introduced the Building Safety Regulator and provisions for high-risk buildings. All people living in flats now know that the entrance doors, external walls and structure of their homes are in scope of fire risk assessments, thanks to the Fire Safety Act. There are new duties for owners and managers of buildings and blocks of flats. The Social Housing Act ensures that landlords are held to account. I have challenged the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea to demonstrate how they have changed by becoming an exemplar landlord and local authority. And I'll be keeping a close eye on their progress. And we will listen to their tenants to assess whether they have succeeded. We are pushing ahead with the remediation acceleration plan to fix all buildings around the country still with dangerous cladding, and where building owners fall short, we will act. We are introducing regulations to improve the fire safety and evacuation of disabled and vulnerable residents in high-rise and higher-risk residential buildings. And as of the 1st of April, ministerial responsibilities for fire functions will move from the Home Office to my department, in line with the inquiry's recommendation that we bring responsibility for fire safety into a single government department. Madam Deputy Speaker, people and their safety are front and centre of our inquiry response. But there remains a stark and terrible reality. The bereaved and the survivors and members of the Grenfell community are still waiting for the justice they need and deserve. And justice must be done. Madam Deputy Speaker, the ongoing Metropolitan Police investigation is amongst the biggest it has ever undertaken, and the Met has the government's full support. In September, the Prime Minister rightly said that this tragedy posed questions about what social justice means in Britain today, whether the voices of working-class people, those with disabilities, those of colour are ignored and dismissed. I am here to say that we will not be that country. We will be a country where decent housing, where security, where safety, where peace of mind are shared by all and not just the privilege of a few. The lessons of this inquiry should not have taken a tragedy to unearth. We will honour the memory of those who lost their lives by bringing about meaningful change in their name, change that will make life better for everyone. We are under no illusions about the scale of the task at hand. The responsibility to deliver lasting change is the privilege of leadership. This will not be done by government alone, but we will put our voice and our power in the service and the cause that the Grenfell community has continued to fight for nearly 8 long years. We will together bring about the transformational change that people of this country deserve. And Madam Deputy Speaker, it is with that admiration for their spirit and the determination to honour it that I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Minister, Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for advance sight of her statements and the Government's response to the Phase 2 report. Can I begin by echoing the sentiments of the Deputy Prime Minister shared across this House? The tragedy of Grenfell, which claimed 72 innocent lives, 54 adults and 18 children, will always remain a scar on our national conscience. Can I thank Sir Martin Moore-Bick and his team for their work? And can I join with the Deputy Prime Minister in offering my deepest apologies to the bereaved, the survivors and the Grenfell community for the failures that led to that horrific night in June 2017, a night where we all remember where we were. Can I also thank them for their constant and constructive campaigning? The inquiry's findings, decades of systemic failure, dishonesty and negligence, are a damning indictment of successive governments, regulators and industry. The government's response, with its acceptance of all 58 recommendations, is a step forward, and I welcome the commitment to action. The creation of a single construction regulator, the appointment of a chief construction advisor, and the consolidation of fire safety functions under one department are long overdue reforms. So too is the focus on professionalising fire engineers and reforming the construction product sector, a sector the inquiry exposed as riddled with systemic dishonesty from firms like Arconic, Kingspan and Celotex. The Green Paper on construction products reform is a promising start, but it must deliver real accountability. Unlimited fines and prison sentences for rogue executives and, where appropriate, government officials cannot remain mere rhetoric. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, ambition must be matched by urgency and scrutiny. Nearly 8 years have passed since Grenfell, yet thousands still live in buildings with unsafe cladding and other fire safety defects. So can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister, although I welcome the fact she's accepted the majority of these recommendations, can I ask her why she has not accepted the inquiry's recommendation for the single regulator to oversee testing and certification of construction products, leaving this instead with conformity assessment bodies? Can I remind her that the Building Research Establishment, itself a conformity assessment body, was strongly criticised for having its own conflicts of interest? The Remediation Acceleration Plan is welcome, but its targets, assessing all buildings by July 2025 and completing works by 2027, rely heavily on developers stepping up voluntarily. What actions will she take if they do not comply? Will she work to deliver solutions for non-qualifying leaseholders and those at risk as a consequence of other fire safety defects? This House needs concrete assurances that no resident will be left behind. I question the phased approach to implementation, stretching beyond 2028. Justice delayed is justice denied, and the Grenfell community has waited long enough for change. Why must they potentially wait another parliamentary term for full delivery? What discussions has the Leader of House had with parliamentary colleagues on the establishment of Public Inquiry's Joint Committee to monitor the implementation of Public Inquiry recommendations? What is the timetable for new publicly available record on all inquiry recommendations since 2024? On social housing, the extension of AWAB's law and new standards are positive, but the government must go further to address the inquiry's wider lessons. Residents' voices were ignored. Tenant empowerment must be more than a panel or a campaign. It needs legal teeth to ensure landlords act on concerns swiftly. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, justice demands accountability. The Metropolitan Police investigation has our full support, but the pace must quicken. Those who profited from cutting corners or who were criminally negligent must face consequences, not just fines, but criminal charges where evidence allows. Grenfell must be a watershed, a legacy of safety, transparency and respect for every resident. Can I make clear our commitment to work with her and her government on a cross-party basis to meet that promise?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for his comments and the way in which he made them, and I hope genuinely that we can work together to continue this piece of work. I recognised in my opening statement the work of the previous government with the Building Safety Act and other measures, and we will continue to work in that vein. I hope the Honourable Member recognises some of the work we're already doing. We've brought forward a significant amount of legislation around social tenancy, around empowering tenants in the Renters' Rights Bill, around leasehold, how we can protect leaseholders, and our remediation acceleration plan. The Government will deliver these legislative changes as soon as parliamentary time allows, and the legislation commitments are detailed in the plan, and that will include creating certainty for buildings that need remediating and who is responsible for remediating them, make obligations for assessing and completing regulation remediation clearer with severe consequences for non-compliance, and give residents greater control in situations of acute harm where landlords have neglected their responsibilities. The Shadow Secretary of State asked me about single construction regulator. We did accept that in principle, but the single regulator will deliver the functions recommended by the inquiry with 2 exceptions to avoid conflicts of interest by both setting the rules for construction products and policing its own compliance. But we will consult on the design of the regulator in the autumn.
Yeah. I call the Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Shalami.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by recognising that today is yet another long, exhausting day for the loved ones of the victims of Grenfell, who are still having to fight for justice nearly 8 years on. I welcome the Secretary of State's response, and I look forward to the Select Committee scrutinising the proposals for the single construction regulator and the Green Paper. But if we're honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the Secretary of State has outlined won't tackle the root cause of the systematic ignorance of concerns of tenants, that toxic stigma which is at the heart of our social housing sector. Can the Secretary of State outline what steps she's taken to make sure that tenants have a voice in the social housing sector and the respect when they raise concerns for their families? Madam Deputy Speaker, we must never forget that 41% of the victims of Grenfell were disabled, a figure which underlines the collective failure of the system to protect those in need. The government's commitment to residential evacuation plans for disabled people in high-rise buildings is a welcome step forward, but I'd be grateful for some clarity from the Secretary of State on how the government intends to make residential PEEPs enforceable if the responsible person fails to identify the vulnerable resident. I'm also pleased that funding has been allocated for this in the social sector. But the reality is disabled people live in all types of housing. So can she give a commitment in her response that disabled people in the private rented sector will have the same access for an evacuation plan to those in the social sector? I'll close, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that none of the families in the gallery should be here today. This tragedy happened in the holy month of Ramadan in 2017. As Ramadan approaches this week, a time that should be dedicated to reflection, to healing, togetherness, too many families are still fighting for justice. No family member present today should have to spend their time demanding accountability when they should be focused on recovering on that trauma. I pay tribute to their tireless effort and pledge to continue to be a voice for them in their fight for justice without any more delay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as Chair of the Housing, Community and Local Committee, I know my honourable friend's commitment to the rights of social housing tenants. The social housing system, as she outlines, has not been fit for purpose, and these failings contributed to the Grenfell tragedy. We're driving up standards in social housing through stronger regulation and enforcement measures, strengthening tenants' voice and improving access to redress. These reforms will ensure landlords are held accountable for the quality of homes and services that they provide. And at the heart of the new regulatory regime is the requirement that all landlords treat tenants with fairness and respect. Social landlords are required to understand and provide information and support that recognises the diverse needs of their tenants, including those arising from protected characteristics and language barriers. And the Government will lay regulations as soon as possible this year on social housing provider funding made available this year for residential PEEPs. We will direct the regulator to set standards on competency and conduct of staff to ensure that tenants are treated with respect. At the national level, we have extended the Social Housing Residents Panel, which will help ensure that tenants' voices and experiences inform policy development. We will keep a new regulatory system under review. We will evaluate its effectiveness by 2028 to ensure it's delivering the improvements we needed. And also, we will set out further measures to strengthen residents' voices in the long-term housing strategy later this year.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Liberal Democrats stand firmly with the many bereaved and their family members, as well as the immediate community, friends, neighbours, as they mourn the 72, including children who tragically lost their lives in 2017. Any steps regarding the changes to the building will be a deeply personal matter for that community, Madam Deputy Speaker. And any decisions regarding the future of the building, I know the Secretary of State will approach with due respect for the local community, survivors and victims. We welcome, therefore, the Government's decision to work with the Grenfell Memorial Commission to design a memorial and urge the Government to approach the discussions, as I'm sure she will, the Secretary of State will, with respect and sympathy to those who suffered. Liberal Democrats are also concerned that as we approach 8 years on from Grenfell, there are still thousands of people in the UK living in buildings with dangerous cladding. The Grenfell Inquiry provided a detailed look at the facts leading up to the night of the 14th of June 2017, including underlying causes of the fire, where mistakes were made, the condition of the tower, the response to the public and emergency services. And with regard to the recommendations to the architectural profession, I refer the House to my register of interests as a member of the Royal Institute. There are lessons, though, to be learned for every authority in the land. We recognise the previous government provided funding to start this process, which is now slowly being allocated to deal with cladding, but now it's time to accelerate that vital work to make all buildings safe. We're concerned that too many developers and building owners are passing the costs of remediation work onto tenants and leaseholders, which puts many at serious financial risk. Liberal Democrats endorse all 57 recommendations of the Grenfell Phase 2 report from Sir Martin Morbick, which includes pointing to creating a legally enforceable order to remediate premises so they are safe on pain of criminal sanction. But we need to take further steps to guard against commercial interests overriding safety, as they did both in the testing of materials and in the enforcement of building regulations. And we would like to see more done to ensure that commerciality will not shockingly and disgracefully once again override interests of safety. It is time to invest in our housing stock so that the cladding is dealt with. It is time for justice for the victims and all those living in unsafe housing. Lib Dems stand ready to work across party to do so.
Can I thank the Honourable Member for his commitment and his support in taking forward the recommendations that came from the inquiry, and also I also thank him for his comments in regards to ensuring that we take decisions about the future of Grenfell in the most sensitive of ways, and I absolutely agree with the Honourable Gentleman, and I'm committed to taking the next steps respectfully and carefully with the community. I'm also continue to support the independent Grenfell Tower Memorial Commission as the community choose a design team to work with them on designing a memorial. Can I also agree with him that the priority is that we have to work at pace as quick as we possibly can, Madam Deputy Speaker, because this work is urgent and we're working as quickly as possible. Some of the inquiry recommendations are wide-reaching and some will require further work, including public consultation before they can be delivered. But where we can work quickly, like the machinery of government change, moving fire to my department as an example, we're committed to do that as well. Hopefully the Honourable Gentleman has heard my words on the acceleration of remediation, our action plan there, and also I agree entirely with his comments, and hopefully that was respected in my response earlier around commerciality not taking precedent or having any control over safety. Safety must come first, and this government is committed to that.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her statement today and the Prime Minister for his statement on September 4th that made clear that the lessons from Grenfell are central to this government's mission. Today is another painful step towards truth, justice and change for the bereaved families of the 72 people who lost their lives at Grenfell, the survivors and the community in my constituency of Kensington and Bayswater, many of which who have joined us here today, and I pay tribute again to their strength and resilience. The fight for justice, now nearly 8 years long, will continue after today and every day until we have criminal prosecutions and true accountability for those responsible, including those companies referenced in the inquiry report. I know the government has looked seriously at the inquiry recommendations, and I welcome the commitment to meaningful change across all of them. But it does remain the case that recommendations from public inquiries too often fail to be implemented. Indeed, if the lessons from previous fires had been learned, including Lakanal House in 2009, then lives would have been saved. This was avoidable. So can the Deputy Prime Minister assure me that the government will consider a strong mechanism of oversight to ensure accountability for implementing what has been set out today, so it lasts beyond any one government and leads to real change? And will she also provide further detail on how she plans to ensure accountability for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, given their culpability before, during and after the fire, and the desperately needed change in their culture and the improvement in the quality of services today in our community?
Can I thank my honourable friend and pay tribute to the way in which he has constructively challenged and worked with us on behalf of his constituents. I know this report has been great personal significance for his constituents, and I pay tribute to his dedicated work as an advocate in calling for truth, justice and change for the Grenfell community. And I agree that robust oversight of government's implementation of the response is essential for this, and all public inquiries. The system needs to be improved, and we are taking forward inquiries recommendations on oversight. We will create a publicly accessible record on Gov.uk of recommendations made by public inquiries since 2024, and we will consider making this a legal requirement as part of a wider review of the inquiries framework. For the Grenfell inquiry recommendations, my department will publish quarterly progress updates on gov.uk until they have all been delivered, and we will report annually to Parliament to enable members to scrutinise our progress and hold us to account. In terms of my honourable friend's comments in regard to the Council failed in some of its most fundamental duties, Madam Deputy Speaker, to keep residents safe, to listen to their concerns and respond effectively when disaster struck. They were right to apologise, but it's clear more must be done. I've welcomed the Council's commitment to improvement and culture change, and I've set my challenge to the leader of the Council to ensure that these improvements are a reality felt by the Council's residents, and I will continue to engage and keep an eye on that progress.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today, and indeed all of our thoughts are, of course, are with the victims and the families of the victims. And I know she will keep us up to date with what is going to happen in terms of a permanent memorial. The key issue here, the big failure that she hasn't spoken about, was of course the testing regime for the products that were put on Grenfell and buildings up and down this country. And the signing off of those testing regimes where firms deliberately cheated on the system, and indeed they were still signed off as being safe. So will she undertake to ensure that the safety mechanisms and testing of products in systems is actually undertaken so that we can ensure
that the buildings for the future and the buildings we've got already will be made safe and safe for the residents that live in them.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments, and I absolutely agree with what he says. The government is committed to a system-wide reform of the construction products regime, ensuring that we address the significant gaps that the Grenfell Inquiry and the independent review of construction product testing have exposed. The construction products green paper that we have published today is a significant step forward towards a construction products regime that has public safety at its heart, and I hope we can continue to work cross-government and cross this House to make sure that we have a system that is fit for purpose for the future.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would the Secretary of State go a little further than she did to my honourable friend, the member for Kensington and Bayswater? It's good that she's going to have a publicly accessible record of recommendations. Will she commit to what the charity inquest and many others have asked for, which is a national oversight mechanism, i.e. a body which collates, analyses and follows up on the recommendations of inquiries and inquests, because otherwise there is a real danger that these recommendations and others will gather dust on the shelf.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I heard directly from members of the Grenfell community their call for the government to introduce a national oversight mechanism. We recognise this goes wider than Grenfell, and it is an important issue for other communities and families as well, that such as those that were affected by COVID-19 and the blood scandal. We're considering this in the year ahead as part of the measures to strengthen public inquiries, and the government will listen to the views of the affected families as part of this consideration.
Julie Lopez.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, the Grenfell tragedy was an appalling one, but it also threw a blanket of uncertainty over countless residents in many of our constituencies who were trapped in cladded properties. So when I hear the Deputy Prime Minister talk about a new regulatory regime and change, I confess I feel very nervous that any changes to the regulatory regime will throw further uncertainty over those who are still trapped in their homes. So can she provide assurances to the House that any move she makes will not create further uncertainty about the standards to which buildings need to be remediated? And then can I also highlight to her the case of my constituents in Harrow Wood who had their buildings assessed by a fire risk assessor who was subsequently struck off. Those people that thought they were going to be released from this terrible stasis are now back to not knowing where they stand. So can she please also look into these concerns?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope that what we're announcing today and what we're trying to do is around bringing clarity to the system. I think one of the things that came out of the Phase 2 report was where the system was disjointed, and actually bringing clarity will hopefully make sure that people understand what they are meant to do, what their legal obligations are, that we expect them to do it, and if they don't do it, there will be serious consequences for those that don't. I also point to the remediation acceleration plan. I completely understand that many people still are in buildings that are unsafe, and that is unacceptable, and that's why this government is taking action on that. And in terms of the Horticultural case that she mentioned, I'm happy for her to meet with the Building Safety Minister.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I thank the Secretary of State for her important statement today. The people of Grenfell were treated badly because of who they were and what they looked like and how much they earned. We say 72 people were killed in Grenfell. The police are holding ashes to which they have no name. And nobody should have to go through this. The family should never have to go through this. This should never happen again. So will the Secretary of State agree with me that, as well as the CEOs of the companies, all of the people in the council who treated the residents badly and did not listen to them because of what they looked like, everybody needs to be held accountable?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. And at the heart of the new regulatory regime is the requirement that all landlords treat their tenants with fairness and respect and take action as that the services they provide are fair and equitable outcomes. Social landlords are required to understand and provide information and support that recognises the diverse needs of their tenants, including those arising from protected characteristics. This hasn't been so in the past, Madam Deputy Speaker, and if I'm honest, it doesn't feel, when I speak to the residents of the community, that it is that today, and that's why I've pushed the council in that particular area, and that's why this government is bringing forward legislation that says we respect people, whether they're social tenants or whether they're private tenants, they deserve a safe and secure home and be treated with dignity and respect.
Tim Farron.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's statement and indeed the moves generally towards centralised regulation and improved safety. Doesn't the report just serve as a single act of shame for this country? As she has just alluded to, it reveals that it has been considered that the safety and the quality of social housing matters less, because the people who live in social housing matter less. Shouldn't there be a matter of deep national repentance of that point of view, which has been the case really since the decline in standards of building since the 1960s? So as she seeks to tackle this, has she spoken to, and is she continue to speak to, her Right Honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, because there is a cost involved in making sure that we build to a high standard as we did in the immediate post-war period, whilst also expanding the number of social rented homes, particularly in parts of the country where build costs are more expensive, like London and like the Lake District.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for the way in which he articulates something that I am still dismayed to this day that archaic attitudes toward people in social tenancy is considered in that way. I was a social tenant for a very long time and grew up in a council house, and the way in which these people were treated, especially after this report. I ask anyone who works in social housing, Madam Deputy Speaker, to read the report, at least read the executive findings if they don't want to go through the chapters that I went through. The horrifying way that people were treated that Sir Martin outlines in his report, and that is a shame for our country, and we must do better, and hopefully the legislation we're bringing forward will bring about a cultural change. And I absolutely agree with him that social housing should be of high quality and safe. It should be affordable, it should be warm, and that's why this government will continue to do it. Safety will not be compromised in building 1.5 million homes, and nor will the 1.5 million homes compromise us on bringing homes that are currently not at standard up to standard, because we've all seen the reports, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've all seen on the television the programmes where people are still living in damp and mouldy properties. That has to end.
Ben Coleman.
Speaker, I also very much welcome the statement by the Deputy Prime Minister. The people who lived in Grenfell Tower and the people in my constituency in Chelsea and Fulham who stands shoulder to shoulder with them. The people have suffered hugely and the pain is still felt throughout the whole community. And I'm delighted to hear my honourable friend, the member for Kensington Bayswater, highlighting again the culpability of the local council and of the contractors, and there is much for the council to do, I know from my own experience, to improve the way that it respects and deals with people living in social housing. I'd also like, if I may, to pick up on the point made very powerfully by my honourable friend from Vauxhall and Camberwell about disabled people, 15 of whom died in the Grenfell Tower because they had no personal emergency evacuation plan. And I welcome, as my honourable friend did, I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's commitment to introduce regulation to improve the fire safety and evacuation of disabled and vulnerable people. But may I ask her, when will we see the details? Will this apply to all disabled residents wherever they live? What legal weight are these regulations going to have so that